Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome back to the 2021 DHS Centers of Excellence Summit. My name is Stu McKenzie. I'm the Science Manager with the Criminal Investigations and Network Analysis Center of Excellence at George Mason University. More importantly, this morning I have the great honor of serving as moderator for this DHS Senior Leadership Panel on Emerging Threats and Challenges. This morning, if you joined us just a little while ago, you'll have heard U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas lay out his perspectives on the Homeland Security space and some specific examples of the roles of the Centers of Excellence within that space. We're going to continue that theme of sort of strategic department level thinking during this panel, which I hope will be uniformly valuable to all attendees. If you're joining us from government, this is sort of an opportunity to take a step back and to cast your eyes a little bit closer to the horizon than is usually feasible. If you're joining us from academia or industry, this is a chance to learn from our four senior leaders what the Homeland Security challenges are that we're going to be working on today and tomorrow. With these outcomes in mind, we have four senior leaders representing TSA, CISA, FLETC, and the Office of Operations Coordination. And I'll invite them to respond to some questions posed by the Centers of Excellence Network for about half an hour. And then we'd like to take a few questions from you watching this live stream. If you look in the virtual event experience over to the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the chat function that will allow you to submit those to our panelists. As time allows, I will pose those to our guests. The remainder, as we probably have about 1,000 people watching this live stream, will be consigned to follow up after the event. So without further preamble, I'll respectfully invite our distinguished panelists to introduce themselves one by one with a name, title, and perhaps a sketch of their primary responsibilities in the department. So we'll proceed in alphabetical order. So Mr. Natarajan, if you're ready, so perhaps I'll ask you to start.
Thanks, it's great to be here today. My name is Nit Natarajan. I'm the Deputy Director for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, here within DHS. We serve as the nation's risk advisor, looking at cybersecurity risk, physical security risk, and emergency communications on behalf of the department in collaboration with our other federal and interagency partners, state, local, tribal, territorial, and private sector and academic partners.
Thank you. So it's good to have you. Ms. Nijkamp.
Good morning and welcome from Colorado Springs, Colorado. My name is Nancy Nijkamp and I'm the Assistant Administrator for the Office of Intelligence and Analysis at the Transportation Security Administration. In this role, I oversee 24/7 intelligence indication and watch functions that support early warning of any potential threats to transportation security, including both aviation and surface modes of transportation. I'm also responsible for overseeing the pre-screening of airline passengers, which we are now very happy to hear is pushing back up to close to 2 million each day as we come out of the pandemic. Traditionally, we screen 72 hours out, so when we're full up, it's about 7.5 million passengers that we pre-screen daily, and then we recurrently screen them. We're also responsible for recurrent vetting of approximately 34 million individuals who have access to the U.S. transportation sector. And we do that, again, recurrently over a 24/7-hour operation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, and we appreciate your time this morning. Rear Admiral Tomney, sir.
Yeah, hey, Stuart. Good morning to you, the panel members, and your audience that's looking. Again, Chris Tomney. I am the Director of the Office of Ops Coordination, which is a headquarters staff working directly for the Secretary. Our primary mission is to provide situational awareness on threats and events affecting the homeland to the entire Homeland Security enterprise. And for us, the Homeland Security enterprise includes not only just DHS operating components, but all other federal, state, territorial, local, tribal partners, as well as the private sector as well. My primary collateral duty, in addition to maintaining that shared situational awareness, is I am the continuity coordinator for the department. And what that means is when our department is having a very bad day, or if our nation is having one of its very bad day, that we are able to maintain our primary mission essential functions on behalf of the American people. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate your time. Mr. Walters.
Walters here. I'm the director of the Federal Law Enforcement Training. This is a large interagency organization. Its real job is to prepare law enforcement. Pretty big. We got 4 major sites. Most law enforcement feds have gone through the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center at one time. Tell them that the menu does change every night. Chow Hall. I started my career in 1975. Border Patrol agents. 75, not 1875. This is a large interagency organization and it shared work organizations. There are about a federal. We also serve state and local.
Director Tomney, forgive me for interrupting, sir. I don't know about other panelists. I've lost your audio. I got most of that for a while, but it is very choppy and very quiet. Can you still hear us, sir? Okay, so I apologize about that. If there's any way to turn your mic up, that will be very useful. I'll also ask our tech support team to get on that. But we appreciate your introduction, sir, and we'll circle back to you. So thank you all very much for your introductions. As I say, we'll circle back to Mr. Walters in a little bit. But on behalf of all the folks watching this live stream, let me express profound gratitude for your valuable time and your invaluable insight. To have the 4 of you gathered together, albeit on this virtual stage, is a rare chance for our audience to see things through a senior leader's perspective for 60 minutes. And we are indebted to you. Thank you. So let's jump into our first question. And we heard the Secretary this morning talk a little bit about the challenges posed by the current pandemic. This is a well-worn topic, but I'll give you a slight spin on this one. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the challenges it's posed, but also how do we, as the Secretary put it this morning, team and learn together, and how can we prepare and strengthen the components' resilience to events of comparable magnitude or severity in the future. And arbitrarily, let's start with Ms. Nijkamp, if you're willing, ma'am. TSA has seen perhaps a fewer travelers during the pandemic and at the same time stricter protocols. But it also must have affected things like assessing risks and threats. What's it been like from the TSA perspective?
Thank you, Stu. It certainly has been a year of great change. And as many of you will remember, we started the year with a strike on the IRGC Quds Force commander, the downing of a Ukrainian commercial airline, an uptick of activity in the Strait of Hormuz, as well as an uptick in Houthi airborne attacks on Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, the global pandemic, which was to your question. So we had to manage our ongoing work of ensuring we had timely and relevant intelligence information to share with TSA decision makers at a very national and strategic level, while at the same time pivoting to take a completely different approach from an intel and vetting perspective to the global pandemic. So I will tell you candidly, it really drilled down to a talented leadership team who could think innovatively and differently. So what we saw was on the vetting side, a very close partnership with CDC to work very hard to prevent people from traveling who should not be traveling. And when I say very hard at a tactical level, this literally would happen within minutes of notification. We'd have to put things in place. So a team that really leaned on protecting our traveling public. And then a team also that looked at all of the massive amounts of information that was coming in on the pandemic, starting very early in 2020. And then how do we take all of that data and assess the data, which had varying levels of reliability, to provide timely, relevant information to TSA decision makers on what we needed to do for force protection for our TSOs who were literally, you couldn't get in much more close contact than when you were going through the checkpoint. And I will tell you, it stretched Intel analysts in a way that we've never seen them stretched before, because they had never looked at perhaps this volume and a lack of certainty of the information that they were given, but they had to make recommendations on dispersion of force protection measures and decisions and information that would help the administrator make decisions. So with regards to that, I would say it stretched us as a TSA, but we came through with very strong leaders. The other thing that was very valuable was partnering with industry. And through this pandemic, what we found as we pivoted to an increased unclassified production and utilization of open source material, we found an opportunity to really further share information, not only on the pandemic, but on all the other threat streams that we continue to monitor. So it really has afforded the opportunity to open several windows for us to look at our mission in a slightly different way, while ensuring that the core mission of those threats to transportation are covered. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. And before I pose the same question to our other panelists, I mean, one of my personal interests in this, I'm abusing my power as moderator now, is, you know, in addition to going to this enormous national effort of addressing this problem, have we thereby sort of built up our resilience a little bit to future problems, or is there still a lot of distance to be covered?
I think to build on the point where we've always had a very strong relationship with academia, and we've always had a very strong relationship with industry, and we've had a strong relationship with individuals in the science and technology area to advance us beyond just my intel and analysis role, but to advance TSA overall. And what this really did is it opened up those windows to really thinking slightly new and really seeing how we could move rapidly, whether it's in technology or, as I mentioned, really strong in information sharing with industry. You know, recently, the attacks or the cyber activities with Colonial Pipeline is a classic example of how we all partner, we across DHS, how we all partner together on those things. And I think the pandemic really drove us to look at things differently and has created an improved resiliency.
Thank you, ma'am. And, you know, since you bring up this this topic of coordination and data, perhaps I'll ask Rear Admiral Tomney next to comment, particularly from the perspective of the National Operations Center. How's it been during the pandemic, and are we better off than we were before?
Yeah, so I guess bottom line up front, Stuart, is absolutely, I think we're better off than we were before. You know, personally, I'm kind of the glass half full kind of individual, and I think we've learned quite a bit from the pandemic. To give you just one example is when the pandemic first started within the National Operations Center, we stood up a crisis action team that was focused around the clock on issues affecting COVID-19 globally. And we did that in order to allow the actual watch to focus on all the other threats affecting the homeland without getting tunnel vision just on this one topic. What we immediately discovered, though, is as we've always done crisis action teams in the past for issues like hurricanes and wildfires, is we found out that a crisis action team doesn't have to necessarily stand the watch in the watch center like the traditional watch, meaning the vast majority, if not all the information was unclassified. So as the nation, as the federal government was now exploring teleworking as really the mainstay of the federal workforce, we too, within the watch, determined that we didn't have to have all our watchstanders coming into the National Operations Center. So in about the first 2.5 months of the pandemic, we shifted our crisis action team to a distributed watch as well. So folks were able to stand the watch just from the comfort of their own home that they were on watch. So I think, again, if there's something we learned as a department, and as a, sorry, yeah, my cat making a cameo appearance. As we learned as a department, as a federal government, I think we are now much stronger as a government to be able to maintain our normal functions in a distributed environment. Many who are watching here may not realize that back last fall, the White House signed out a new federal mission resiliency strategy. And that's about talking about how do we build in resiliency into our day-to-day operations. If you think back about how we did resiliency during the Cold War, we had a number of fixed sites around the country, bunkers and mountains where folks would go to if there was a crisis, and they would all hunker down into these command bunkers. If there's anything we learned here through the pandemic is we no longer need to maybe have as many of these bunkers because folks could just distribute and go to their various places where they reside, and for the most part, be able to continue their function. So if we lose power, if we lose connectivity in one part of the nation, we still have our workforce that's distributed who may be able to still carry out the mission.
Thank you, sir. And on the subject of sort of distributed workforce, let me turn to Mr. Natarajan for his views, because CISA has this really interesting mission throughout the United States where you're working with constituents all over the country, kind of acting in an advisory capacity and shoring up resilience, on a day-to-day basis as part of your mandate. What's your experience been, and do you think we're more resilient from a CISA perspective than we were? And sir, you may be on mute.
So the one of the things that we're looking at is how do we institutionalize what we've learned? So I think we definitely are more resilient than we've been. As I look at, in a former life, I was in the public health world, so I've been working in the pandemic space for about 20 years. And, we talked about a lot of the challenges 12, 13 years ago about everybody teleworking and whether the infrastructure could sustain it, whether we could truly, go to a distributed workforce. And at the time, we weren't sure. I think what we've learned now is we can. We've proven it. We've done it for, a little over a year now. We've seen a lot of that accelerated transformation in the digital space, right? A lot of individuals over the last number of years have transitioned their workspace to the cloud, or they rapidly did after the pandemic kicked in. And they implement a lot of these policies and procedures and protocols for their organizations to be able to function in this distributed environment, how to maintain those relationships and those engagements with a lot of our critical partners, both domestically and globally. And a way to do that in the new environment, how to deal with classified work and unclassified work in that type of environment as well. So I think we've made a lot of changes, either leading up to the pandemic or shortly after the pandemic. One of the things I'm looking at, and as we focus on now, is how do we institutionalize the changes that we've made, right? If we revert back to how things were, have we truly changed that resilience paradigm? Have we truly taken and moved the ball forward as we prepare for whatever the next incident is, right? Whether it's another pandemic, which, there will be future pandemics at some point, right? We're good for that if we look over the ages. But also, whether it's from other types of impacts of critical infrastructure, right? Whether it's a blackout, as we saw in the Northeast power outage back 2004, 2005-ish, a lot of these types of things are going to continue to happen. So to me, it's we need to learn from what we've done. We need to institutionalize what we've done. We need to continue to invest in the capabilities and the technology and the systems, not just from a digital sense, but also from a personnel sense. How do we ensure that our people are well equipped and able to execute the mission as we go forward? I mean, how do we look at things like strengthening the supply chain? I think that both the pandemic and as well as other recent events we've seen in ransomware and other types of cyber events, the dependence on the supply chain. And I think, some of those things that have come to light over the last couple of years, to many of us who've been in this space for a long time, are not a surprise, right? I mean, they've just kind of more made it to the public light and more broader visibility. So how do we institutionalize our ability to identify risks in the supply chain, to mitigate those risks the best we can, to accept the risks we can't mitigate, right? And because any risk we identify and we can't mitigate or choose not to mitigate, we're accepting to a certain level. And then how do we build that capability and capacity to maintain this in the future against new both cyber threats as well as non-cyber threats? So I think that institutionalization of this, not just within our component, within CISA or within the department, I think looking at at organizations in the public and private sector throughout the nation, throughout the globe, that institutionalization aspect is really going to be critical to our continued future success and to really raise that bar in resilience.
I think you're right, sir. And one of the things that motivates my question is, acknowledging the widespread global loss of life and the tragedy of this particular event, we sort of at the same time owe it to ourselves to say, okay, well, look, if the next one has similar characteristics to this virus, but is a strain of Ebola or Zika or some virus that has a much higher mortality rate, how ready are we for that? So that's a familiar issue for you. Let me turn to Director Walters, and sir, we'll see whether your audio's playing ball with us. Could we do a quick sound check, sir?
How do you copy me now?
Much better now. Thank you very much. So we appreciate it. Let me circle back and invite you to give your introduction again, if you wouldn't mind. Just say a few words about your primary role at FLETC.
I'm the director of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. I come from a Border Patrol background. I joined the Border Patrol in 1975. That's 1975, not 1875, just in case there's any question about that. I'm the director of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center since 2017. So in order to address the subject, I need to tell you a little bit about the context, because National School for Law Enforcement Professionals. FLETC is really a multi-agency cooperative. I have 100 or so federal law enforcement agencies that are members of our federal law enforcement training community, and they can be about 50% of the resources needed to get trained at FLETC, and FLETC could be the challenge, resiliency challenge.
Director Walters, please forgive me for interrupting. I sincerely apologize. We're getting a lot of buffering, which probably means I'm interrupting you in about 5 seconds time. But we've sort of lost your audio because of I think the internet connectivity issues. So I'm very sorry about that, sir. I wonder if your staff could help tinker with that a little bit, and again we'll come back to you. I do apologize for the technical issues. We're really looking forward to hearing your perspective. Reluctantly, let me move on to another question here, and I think we might start with Ms. Nijkamp again, but this is really open to all panelists. Earlier this month and again this morning in his remarks, Secretary Mayorkas underscored domestic terrorism as a key priority. And the question from our Centers of Excellence is, what strategic measures are being developed to deal with domestic terrorist threats on soft targets and crowded places? Ms. Nijkamp, do you want to take that first?
Sure, thank you. It was very good to hear the Secretary's remarks this morning. And there is a grave concern about domestic violent extremism and domestic terrorists as threats to our homeland security. You know, I started the answer to the last question with talking about how much has changed in the last 12 to 18 months with regards to threats in the pandemic. And certainly this is yet another change. We've watched multiple peaceful demonstrations continue as peaceful demonstrations, and then those that have escalated into violence that went on to attacks and forced entry into the Capitol while our legislative branch was in session. And so with regards to that, you could see a threat to our continuity of government. And so it's a threat that we take very seriously. And it's a very challenging and dynamic threat. And I want to emphasize the challenging and dynamic. It brings a whole set of new challenges. And so as we take a look at this and see new kinds of actors who have evolved some of their attack methods and have revisited previously used attack methods, and have taken technology and social media to perhaps a different plane than we've seen in the past, we still go back and focus on our core mission of safeguarding aviation and transportation security for surface transportation, such as rail, pipeline, bus lines, very seriously. And we apply similar analysis, similar vetting to this threat as we would to the foreign terrorist threat or to the racially motivated violent extremism. And we take the same approach to protection from a strategic perspective, both hard and soft targets. So whether it is a insider who places an explosive device on the Russian Metrojet and downs the Russian Metrojet, or foreign terrorists who are motivated to conduct a attack on the public side, a very soft target at the Brussels airport, we still apply the same approach, being very respectful to individuals' rights. And so across the vast and vital global transportation sector, we do look at the cost of terrorism. And we know that within the transportation sector, the cost of terrorism is high, no matter how we measure it. And so our mission and our resolve hasn't wavered, even though we have to be very mindful of rights, and that this threat is slightly different, just like it was a slightly different approach to the global pandemic. Around the clock, I mentioned my 24/7 indications, intelligence, and warning watches, as well as our pre-screening of passengers and our vetting of transportation insiders. We continue to do that to identify potential threats and then apply the appropriate measures to reduce risks of those threats to the traveling public. And we do that in partnership with industry, and we work closely with industry from airlines, airports, rail, cargo, and pipeline, as well as with Congress. And we also consult our intelligence community counterparts and state and local law enforcement authorities, as well as federal law enforcement authorities, and as mentioned by Secretary Mayorkas, academia. And we do all this in consult to make sure we get the information right, so we can apply the right measures and we can share the right information to reduce the risk to the traveling public. And we look forward to continuing to work with DHS Centers of Excellence on innovative new initiatives and process improvements to strengthen our overall approach to intelligence and vetting. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. And I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Thank you guys for muting your mics. Rear Admiral Tomney, I wanted to turn to you because the National Operations Center has a slight overlap in what Ms. Nijkamp was describing there in terms of open source data analysis and the situational awareness. What are you seeing in terms of strategy on soft targets and open spaces and domestic extremism?
Yeah, a couple things come to mind there, Stuart. First of all, one part of my staff is our special events program, where we work with state and local partners around the country to make sure they have the federal resources that are required to safely run an event. And these are events that are nominated by state and local partners to get a national, what we call a SEER rating, which stands for a special event assessment rating. And SEER ratings go from a level 1 down to a level 5. Level 1 and level 2 events are ratings where are the highest ratings, and we apply a federal coordinating team to work with our state and local partners to safely run these events. SEER level 1 events are kind of the internationally recognized iconic events like a Super Bowl, like a Tournament of Roses parade, etc. SEER level 2 events are just below level 1. We got a SEER level 2 event coming up next week, which is the Indianapolis 500 Motor Speedway events. So again, we put in place a federal coordinating team to work with the state and local partners as a central coordinator to provide federal resources. Could be anything from additional bomb sniffing dogs to additional magnetometers to aircraft to provide crowd surveillance. One of the things my staff works with when we talk about soft targets is we also have the lead within DHS to how do we counter unmanned aerial systems during mass gathering events. And I would say that's a key area we could work with centers of excellence going forward, because that, I can tell you, that's a high demand, low density type of commodity at the present time. And there's a lot of challenges with dealing with how do you counter a UAS when you have a large crowd below it, so you don't create, a flying piece of hardware that could come crashing down on the crowd. So again, developing that technology to safely take control, technology that can quickly help to identify the individuals monitoring those UAS systems when you have a large crowd underneath it. The other thing that we really are struggling with right now, to the point that that my colleague just mentioned about social media, is just the plethora of information that's out there. And how do we truly find the needle in a stack of needles that are out there? Right now we are getting, monitoring everything from tweets to other types of social media. And it's real quick to get an alert that someone is tweeting something suspicious, but then we have to fall back into the traditional labor-intensive way of trying to run to ground whether or not that's a legitimate threat or not. So we are at the point where we are data saturated. So again, helping us to develop technology in which to immediately pull our attention to truly what is most important out there in cyberspace versus all the other chaff that may be out there.
Thank you, Director Tomney. And I'm sorry, Mr. Natarajan, did you have a comment, sir?
Yeah, I just wanted to add real quick. I think, as we look at CISA, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of folks are right now in the news is the cybersecurity side. On the non-cyber side, we definitely do help lead our efforts on the soft targets and crowded spaces security efforts, right? So one of the things that we look at, and there's a lot of information up on our website for folks to look at, are things like active shooter preparedness programs. Our Office of Bombing Prevention is heavily engaged with organizations and law enforcement agencies throughout the country in order to kind of help increase preparedness as communities prepare for the events that Admiral Tomney mentioned, SEER events, as well as other types of both large scale and small scale events throughout the nation. I think that, we have over 500 staff throughout the nation on the ground to help our partners increase this. And we found it's been effective, but we're chipping away at it's a very large issue. We heard most recently within the last couple of months on an active shooter situation where a company across the street from that active shooter had actually been through our training a couple of weeks earlier and found it beneficial in how their organization would respond. And I think it's helpful from a one-off, but how do we expand that, right? How do we help prevent and how do we help prepare these organizations, and whether they're schools, public venues, houses of worship, against all these types of potential threats we're facing on the domestic side, especially, again, kind of those soft targets and crowded places, especially those that need to find that balance between openness and security, right? How do you maintain public access while at the same time maintaining an adequate security posture against these evolving threats, which are continuing to evolve on a regular basis. So I think there's a lot of work being done across the department in a coordinated and collaborative way to tackle this, but recognizing that a lot of those changes are going to be on the ground with our partners and utilizing new and emerging technologies. I know there's a lot of work being done both in the public and private sectors to try to identify new mechanisms to, again, kind of increase security in these public spaces. And it'll be great to see that evolve in the coming years.
Thank you, sir. And, if we have time, I'd like to revisit this, what will be a theme of the summit, which is, how do we use data effectively against homeland security challenges while preserving rights and privacy, which are very important concerns. At the same time, I know I'm going to have to turn to audience questions fairly soon. Let me just ask one follow-up question to Ms. Nijkamp. And then I'd like to see if we can get Director Walters, because I'm very eager to have his input in this discussion. Ms. Nijkamp, Rear Admiral Tomney talked about CounterUAS. And by the way, our program managers and engineers are feverishly scribbling their to-do lists as they listen to you all, so thank you. But I just wanted to give you a chance to comment because Our colleagues out of Northeastern University at the Alert Center have a fantastic drone facility. They do a lot of work with TSA and they do a lot of counter-UAS stuff. But I know that TSA recently did some testing, I think in Miami on counter-UAS. Am I dreaming that up?
So I'm not entirely sure of the location, but yes, we have a very aggressive counter-UAS program that we are working on. It is led by another office within TSA. Within my office, we have invested resources very heavily into what we would call emerging threats. I mentioned cybersecurity. We are working very closely with CISA and industry for specific potential vulnerabilities within the transportation sector, almost to fill what we perceived as a gap. And really, quite candidly, it grew out of, due to the pandemic, we had such a reduction in passenger volume. We were able to take resources and look for areas that we might be able to see growth opportunities to counter emerging threats. One of those was counter-UAS. And again, working very closely with CISA, we have field intelligence officers who work closely both with CISA in the field as well as airport authorities and local law enforcement to go ahead and report rather immediately on counter-UAS and UAS intrusions into certain areas that might be linked to some sort of nefarious activity. You know, the vast majority of this are individuals who might be like my 13-year-old son who's out having enjoyment and fun time with his drone, which I've advised him you have to put all the warnings in because we live close to DC and we're not going to get in trouble with that. But, you know, we do have concerns. And again, I want to emphasize the partnership we have with both local as well as other DHS components with the FBI, because clearly when you take what we see internationally, and I mentioned the uptick in Houthi attacks in Saudi Arabia, but across the board, where they're much more sophisticated UAS vehicles, and you know, you apply some of those tactics, you could see how they could be used with I don't want to say with relative ease, but they could be used here in the United States. And you mentioned the Centers of Excellence and the partnering with that. I think it is absolutely invaluable, that partnership with regards to technology for counter-UAS. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We love the counter-UAS problem in the COA network because it touches a lot of components. Obviously, it's technical, and it's amazing how many nefarious activities they can be used for that we have to think about now. I do want to leave time. I really hope we can get Director Walters now. Could we test your sound, sir? I do have a question specifically for you.
Let us test the sound. How does it sound?
The sound sounds good, although I've said that before. So let's see how we do. Let me pull up a question that I had specifically for you, sir, because I do want to make sure we get your perspective. Give me just a second. So, you know, speaking about pivoting to deal with the current pandemic and building capacities, you know, we've talked about some threats, but our chief resource in assessing those threats and dealing with them is personnel, right? That's not a platitude. That's just a fact of an organization like DHS. What are the emerging skill sets that FLETC has been sort of pivoting to train the thousands of officers that come through in? What are some of the new things that FLETC is doing to meet emerging challenges?
That's a great question. The challenge that's emerging for federal law enforcement training, it's both old and new. Well, our challenge is moving at the speed of change. FLETC's mission has not changed much in the last 50 years. But what has changed is the speed and the impact of the changes to the environment in which the law enforcement officers operate. So we're focused on our traditional mission, which is prepare law enforcement officers to do their job in their operating environment. And that mission statement is as powerful and ever present and constant as the force of gravity. It just doesn't change. But what has changed is the environment in which the officers do their jobs. It's changing at a pace more rapid than at any time in history. I think we can all agree on that. More and more criminal activity is now organized and coordinated online. The clues that their illegal activity is being perpetrated are found just as much online as they are on the scene. And so our new people are a little bit more attuned to that, but our systems are not. Our challenges are the challenges that all law enforcement faces, and I think our strategic plan sort of adequately states the problem. So just to quote it, it says, our law enforcement community and the universe of malefactors are locked in a continuous and steadily accelerating cycle of tactics and counter-tactics, strategies and counter-strategies. And last year's tools and technologies and tactics rapidly fade into obsolescence. And organizations that do not adapt are left behind. So our challenge is to try not to be left behind in this dynamic environment. For those who threaten our people in our institutions, they constantly adjust their tools and techniques. They attacked our servers rather than our banks now. Law enforcement organizations, law enforcement training institutions such as FLETC track these adjustments and develop strategies to stay ahead of them. By way of example, in today's environment, and here's more to your question, cameras are everywhere, but capturing the videos and preparing them for presentation in legal proceedings is a complex and technical legal process. Cybercrime, ransomware, the dark web, digital monetary instruments, it's like Bitcoin, they're integral into more and more crimes. And so the forensics of how these things are used is only now developing. But part of the difficulty is the law enforcement expertise and developing in randomized pockets. The lessons learned are often developed in isolation in local, state, federal law enforcement agencies or organizations around the country. And while these are shared, the process, and here's where we can use a lot of help, the process of sharing those tactics and lessons learned hasn't changed much in the last century. By the way, I know about the last century, I was there. So back to the training aspect of this challenge. Our challenge at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers is to mine the lessons learned on changes in the operating environment quickly from wherever those lessons and tactics can be found. We rely on sources such as the DHS Centers of Excellence, for example, research with universities, grant-funded studies, and national police organizations like ICP and the NSA, as well as our own connections with federal law enforcement members. So we're most interested in the practical solutions developed by the law enforcement officers anyway. Our challenge is to be thorough enough and fast enough to make a difference. Our challenge is to become aware of the successful enforcement strategies and tactics promulgated in Anywhere USA and to capture, to absorb, and process the lessons law enforcement officers learn in the field, and then synthesize what those lessons are into the practical wisdom part of it into training the tens of thousands of law enforcement officers that enable our government to function. So I'll close with this. What FLETC needs is eyes to see, ears to hear, and the counsel of the wise. That is to see with the collective eyes of the 800,000 federal, state, and local tribal law enforcement officers out there, and to hear the voices of 300 million people that rely on law enforcement services, and to seek the counsel of the wise, that is to bring together subject matter experts on law enforcement training, adult learning, that's legislators, community leaders, NGOs, to make sense of what we see and to hear. With that, I'll close, and I know others have got things to say.
Thank you very much, sir. I really appreciate that, and that was clear as a bell. So it's great to have you back with us. Well, I'm very begrudgingly going to share you with our audience because they have some questions for you, because I think we could easily fill a few hours with the kind of information that we're getting. And again, from Mr. Walters, I think a fantastic to-do list from our constituents here. But let me move on to a few audience questions, because I do want to leave time for just a few of those. I'm going to start this one, I think, with Mr. Natarajan, if you would, sir. And I'm going to read this out. Based on the changing set of cybersecurity threats that DHS identifies and tracks, is there a set of challenge problems that DHS publishes to seek solutions from industry?
So I think that we publish. I'm not sure we have necessarily everything in a concise kind of published document. I think we've been very vocal about sharing where the challenges are in this ever evolving landscape. I think that as we look at both from a cybersecurity side, but also on a physical security side, is how do we keep up with the pace of technology? How do we keep up with the pace of the adversary? And how do we help mitigate a lot of these risks? How do we raise the cost, time, and complexity of attacks? I think are all things that we're looking at. I think as we look at risk across the nation, including on the international front and those relationships there, how do we just identify what that landscape looks like? How do we identify what that platform of critical infrastructure looks like? I think as we've talked a lot about critical infrastructure for years. I've been in the space for over 15 years. I'm not sure we've even mapped out what that looks like. Right? Have we mapped out what is our nation's critical infrastructure? What are all those dependencies and interdependencies between them? How do we understand the risk and the vulnerability that are pinpointed in those dependencies and interdependencies? And then on top of that, how do we understand and mitigate some of that risk, right? So we've tackled pieces of it. We've looked at identifying critical infrastructure. We've looked at identifying national critical functions. We've looked at identifying these elements of it. But to actually put that together, I think is a massive, massive undertaking, right? So I think we've done a good job about being vocal about various elements of it. I think it is a good question of how do we kind of put that together into kind of a concise document. I know we've been in collaboration with the COEs and our colleagues over at S&T to work very precisely at how we can work together to do the R&D and the research to come up with solutions that can be transferred into the operational realm, right? We don't want to end up creating solutions in isolation that cannot be transferred into operations. So we've started to have some of those discussions around specific discrete elements and programs that we felt we could tackle. It's something that's been underway for about 2 years now, but it's something that we're really looking to mature and evolve over the next 2 to 3 years, so we can get to more of that kind of a list that we could tackle. We did look at this about 7 or 8 years ago. There was an R&D list that was somewhat created coming out of Presidential Policy Directive 21, looking at critical infrastructure, where we tried to kind of catalog what is the list that we can provide to the COEs and to academia to kind of come up with what those lists of solutions are. I'm not sure we've gone back since that it was initially published, and based on the evolving threat landscape we've seen to update that. But I think we want to continue to kind of have that dialogue with folks. And part of it is us continuing to learn and understand from what's the art of possible, right? I mean, there's a lot of work happening out there. How do we better educate ourselves through forums such as this to understand what is happening in the research world, so we can even understand what's possible? I mean, I always joke I'd love to teleport coffee to my hand, right? And the technology doesn't exist yet, but we want to ask for things that are possible. We want to ask for things that are cutting edge and pushing the envelope, that are still within the realm of reason, right? So having that dialogue and being able to learn from all of you out in the audience, I think is helpful to us, as well as we try to shape some of those. So we don't just come up with a list of things that everyone looks at and says, we can't do this, but we can come up with a list of things that we can actually invest in, come up with outcomes, and then operationalize those outcomes, which I think is really one of the key steps in that.
Thanks for fielding that, sir. And there are so many parts of what you said that we'll be picking up through the summit program in these focus panels and our tech showcase. So I really took those to heart. I think we might squeeze in just one question, and I regret that 60 minutes is such a short time to spend with the four of you. Really interesting question as all four of you liaise with folks at the federal, state, local, tribal level. So this is for any of you. What do you see as the future role of the National Guard regarding Homeland Security?
Yeah, so I'll maybe start off with that. So as we've seen over the past year, National Guard has been instrumental in a number of the civil unrest that we had in a number of cities over the past year. I think if there's anything we learned about that is probably with our law enforcement partners, and I would certainly enjoy hearing Director Walter's points as well. I think we could be doing a better job within our law enforcement community about prior coordination on these events. National Guard, as we all know, DoD is stretched very thin with capabilities. And I think my personal take is over the past year, we maybe were over-reliant on the National Guard, where if we had better coordination mechanisms between various law enforcement agencies, we may not have needed the National Guard as much as we did. To me, I think our citizen soldiers should be a last resort that we need to call upon here in the U.S. With I think Tom mentioned 800,000 sworn law enforcement officers around the country. I'd like to think in most situations, the better coordination we could use, we would not need the National Guard, only in those rare exceptions going forward. Tremendous capability, short in supply given their global missions, but should only be used in the most dire situations.
Director Walters, would you like the last word on that one?
Yeah, I would. Thank you. I think the Border Patrol has got this right, either by design or driven by the whips and chains of circumstance. They've got it right. When they're stressed, they use the National Guard to do the non-law enforcement jobs and put their law enforcement people doing the law enforcement jobs, allows them to focus on their primary mission essential function. And so that's where they're useful. But on the other hand, the National Guard does have pieces that are valuable to law enforcement, but know what you're asking for. Be specific about what you need. Don't just ask for the National Guard. You'll get whatever they send you. But they do have some good capabilities, and they're a good resource to understand the local community as well, because they're in and of the local communities. You're just talking to them is a lesson learned for a lot of us. And with that, I'll end. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. And I regret the wish so short of time. I'm going to take some of the other questions. We'll have the team gather those together and respectfully continue that discussion after the event today. Selfishly, I'm going to grab the last 60 seconds from each of you just to pose you one final question to get our audience thinking as they go into our sort of focus track panels and tech showcases and other discussions. And the question is this: if you could look 10 years into the future, what does your component or your office look like, and how has it evolved to meet some of the threats and the future threats that we've been talking about today? Let me start with Ms. Nijkamp.
Thank you so much, Stu, and I love this question. I'll look 10 years into the future, or perhaps even further. We would be taking intelligence from national level, operational level, down to tactical level that we may have gotten from a fusion center or from local law enforcement, and we would be combining all of that information with the information that we also get from the pre-screening of our passengers and vetting of our transportation workers, and we would marry that up with technology, and you would have the best experience ever at the checkpoint, where you were able to walk through a touchless screening event. As I said, 10 years or maybe more in the future, but it absolutely is dependent upon good vetting, good intel, and a close cooperative marriage with technology and centers of excellence and industry. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Natarajan, I'm going to give you your 60 seconds. It's in the future. What does CISA look like?
So I think we'll have a lot more visibility on risk, vulnerability, on how we can mitigate a lot of that risk, how we can increase our nation's resilience and be able to measure that in a quantitative way to really know where the investments have been valuable. I think as that cyber physical nexus continues to get bigger, as we look at the Venn diagram of 10 years in the past where cyber and physical were separate, we've started to see that come together. I think that overlap is going to grow over the next 10 years. So our ability to address those issues in a coordinated manner, bringing those two worlds together in our engagements with our partners across both the federal executive branch, but also with state, local, tribal, and territorial partners in the private sector, as well as looking at globally, working with our international partners to further build that relationship and that partnership over the next 10 years to really better learn from them on what's successful over there, for them to learn from us, and to be able to look at risk not from a national perspective here within the United States, but looking at it from all of our global dependencies, especially when it comes to things like supply chain and a lot of those challenges. So better visibility, better understanding as to what's happening there, and being able to better measure our efforts to enhance resilience of the nation.
That's great. Thank you, sir. Rear Admiral Tomney, what's the future of the Office of Operations Coordination?
Yeah, so we're already moving out towards that future. We have a 5-year strategic plan where we're looking at trying to be recognized as the leading integrator of operations, operational information, and decision making. Over the past year, I appointed a information sharing data analytics officer. So for us, it's not necessarily getting access to information. We are flooded with information right now. So it's much more artificial intelligence, machine learning, calling our watchstanders' attention to breaking in real-time events around the homeland, and then providing us in real time what's that operational response. I mentioned Stu, in an earlier question, that right now we get the immediate tweet that there may be a shooting event, there may be a suspicious vehicle, but is that shooting event the start of an active shooter event, or is that a local gang relating shooting or domestic incident? You don't know immediately right off the bat. And oftentimes, while we are initially tipped off, we are then struggling using the manual method of calling around diffusion centers, calling law enforcement agencies to try to get to the ground truth. I think in the future for us, it would be using machine learning to actually separate what is a local domestic incident, gang-related shooting versus what is the start of an active shooter event.
Understood. Thank you, sir. And Mr. Walters, same question for the future of FLETC.
Thanks, Ed. We just passed our 50th anniversary last year. So in the year 2031, 10 years from now, I expect the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, and I'm sure the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers will be the nation's enterprise resource for federal law enforcement training. So if anybody anywhere needs anything that the federal law enforcement community has, we'll be a conduit for that. If they want to make an impact on the federal law enforcement training community, this will be the place to go.
Thank you, sir, and thank you all for your input. Every part of this hour has been an absolute joy except this one, because we're actually out of time. So, I really hope that this morning's discussion has built a useful strategic framework for our colleagues in government, industry, and academia to enter these focused track sessions. You're going to be hearing a lot of the topics that we've discussed in this panel delved into in more detail and more specificity to those challenges throughout this 2-day program. And you can also acquaint yourselves with some of the cutting edge solutions alluded to in passing here by the Centers of Excellence. That capability showcase is at 4 p.m. today. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and most importantly, to express our sincere gratitude as a collective summit once again to our distinguished senior leaders, Assistant Administrator Nancy Niekamp, Deputy Director Nitin Natarajan, Rear Admiral Christopher Tomney, and Director Thomas Walters. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity to see emerging threats and challenges from your perspectives across the department. And with that, I'll reluctantly draw the session to a close. Don't forget to join us back here in the virtual event experience at 1 p.m. For our next session on economic impacts of COVID-19, and also a panel on COE models of public-private partnerships. In the meantime, from our distinguished panelists from Stu McKenzie, it's been a pleasure, and enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you all.